In 2019, a soybean farmer in Iowa named John Heisdorfer took his own life. He was 63, fourth-generation farmer, president of his county's farm bureau. His suicide note mentioned one thing repeatedly: the tariffs. He'd watched his exports to China collapse from $14 billion to nearly zero in 18 months. He wasn't alone. That same year, across the Pacific in Guangdong province, over 400 factories closed their doors. 5 million workers, most earning less than $400 a month, lost their jobs. And in Vietnam, Malaysia, and Bangladesh, factory wages dropped by an average of 12% as corporations played countries against each other for the cheapest labor. This is what a trade war actually looks like. Not a chess match between leaders, not a strategic victory, but millions of ordinary people watching their lives collapse while two superpowers refuse to blink. Let's go back to where this started. In January 2018, the United States imposed tariffs on solar panels and washing machines. It seemed small. But by July, the US had placed 25% tariffs on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods, targeting everything from steel to semiconductors. China retaliated within hours, matching dollar for dollar. By September 2019, the US had tariffs on $550 billion of Chinese imports. China responded with tariffs on $185 billion of American goods. The numbers were staggering, but the justification was simple. The US claimed China had stolen intellectual property worth $600 billion annually and manipulated its currency to keep exports artificially cheap. China countered that America was trying to contain its rise and protect its declining industries through protectionism. Both had legitimate points. China's forced technology transfers and state subsidies did violate WTO principles, but American manufacturing had been declining for decades due to automation and corporate decisions, not just Chinese competition. Still, nuance doesn't win elections. What followed was economic brinkmanship at a scale the world hadn't seen since the 1930s. Here's what the textbooks won't tell you. Trade wars don't have clean casualties. They're not fought on battlefields with clear front lines. They spread like cracks in glass, following the hidden lines of a globalized economy that took 70 years to build. Within 6 months of the first major tariffs, the World Trade Organization reported that global trade growth had fallen from 4.7% to 2.6%. That might sound abstract, but translate it. $2 trillion in goods that would have crossed borders didn't. Ships sat idle in ports. Factories that depended on just-in-time delivery started hemorrhaging money on storage costs. A Ford plant in Michigan waited 3 weeks for aluminum parts that used to arrive in 4 days, simply because the logistics chain had been optimized for a world where US and Chinese goods flowed freely. European manufacturers found themselves in impossible positions. A German automaker like BMW needed Chinese rare earth elements for batteries, American software for autonomous systems, and European labor for assembly. When tariffs hit, they couldn't simply choose a side. Their costs increased by 11% in a single year, according to the German Association of the Automotive Industry. French luxury brands watched their China sales, which represented 33% of global revenue, drop by a fifth as Chinese consumers boycotted Western products in a surge of economic nationalism. But the real chaos hit Southeast Asia. When factories started fleeing China, Cambodia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh thought they'd won the lottery. Foreign direct investment in Vietnam increased 67% in 2019 alone. Sounds great, until you realize their infrastructure couldn't handle it. Ports in Haiphong became so congested that shipping times tripled. Power grids in industrial zones collapsed regularly. One textile manufacturer in Dhaka told Reuters they spent more on backup generators in 2019 than they'd spent on electricity in the previous 5 years combined. The promised boom became a logistical nightmare, and the savings corporations expected from cheaper labor were eaten alive by delays and infrastructure costs. Then came 2020, and COVID-19 did what the trade war had only started. It shattered the global supply chain completely. When China locked down Wuhan and Guangdong province, the world suddenly realized that 60% of its active pharmaceutical ingredients, 80% of its electronics components, and nearly all of its personal protective equipment came from one country. The trade war had made nations want to diversify. The pandemic made it desperate. But you can't rebuild 70 years of industrial specialization in 70 days. The US tried. The Defense Production Act was invoked to manufacture ventilators domestically. It took American companies 4 months to produce what Chinese factories made in 4 weeks, at triple the cost. Europe faced similar failures. By April 2020, Italian hospitals were rationing ventilators not because of tariffs, but because the trade war had created a fragmented supply chain that couldn't respond to a synchronized global crisis. And here's the part that gets lost in geopolitical analysis. The human cost wasn't evenly distributed. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, American families paid an average of $1,277 more per year by the end of 2019 due to tariff-inflated prices. But that average hides everything. For families earning under $30,000 annually, that represented 4.3% of their income. For families earning over $100,000, it was barely 1%. The trade war was regressive taxation, dressed up as economic patriotism. In China, the impact was different but equally brutal. The country's export sector employed over 180 million people directly or indirectly. When US orders collapsed, it wasn't the billionaire factory owners who suffered most. It was the migrant workers from rural provinces who'd spent 20 years sending money home. Chen Wei, a 52-year-old assembly line worker in Shenzhen, had worked at the same electronics factory since 1998. When it closed in October 2019, he returned to his village in Anhui province to discover that 2 decades of remittances hadn't been enough. His family had debts from his son's education, his father's medical bills. There was no safety net, no retraining program, just the quiet erosion of a life built on the promise that globalization would lift everyone. These aren't anomalies. They're the system working exactly as designed. When corporations needed to cut costs, they cut people. When governments needed to look strong, they imposed tariffs. And when both needed someone to blame, they pointed at each other while the middle class in both countries paid the bill. But the trade war evolved. By 2020, it wasn't really about soybeans or steel anymore. It was about who would control the technologies that define the 21st century. The flashpoint was Huawei. In May 2019, the US placed Huawei on the Entity List, effectively banning American companies from selling it semiconductors or software. The justification was national security. Huawei's 5G equipment could theoretically allow Chinese intelligence to spy on Western communications. China saw it differently, an attempt to kneecap its most successful tech company just as it was about to dominate the next generation of telecommunications. What followed was a semiconductor arms race. The US convinced Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which produces 92% of the world's advanced chips, to stop supplying Huawei. China responded by investing $150 billion in domestic chip production through its Made in China 2025 initiative. The US countered with the CHIPS Act, allocating $52 billion to rebuild American semiconductor manufacturing. Here's the problem. You can't just will the semiconductor industry into existence. It takes decades to develop the expertise, the supply chains, the specialized equipment. A single advanced chip fabrication plant costs $20 billion and requires machines from the Netherlands, chemicals from Japan, designs from the US, and manufacturing expertise from Taiwan and South Korea. The global chip industry isn't a supply chain, it's an ecosystem. And both countries were trying to replicate it in isolation. The result? By 2023, chip shortages had cost the global auto industry $210 billion in lost revenue, according to consulting firm AlixPartners. Your new car costs $5,000 more and arrived 6 months late, not because of a pandemic, but because the trade war had turned semiconductors into geopolitical weapons. So where does this leave us? The trade war didn't end. It just evolved into a new reality: economic blocks. Countries are being forced to choose. India wants to manufacture iPhones while buying Russian oil and maintaining border disputes with China. It's trying to be non-aligned in a world that no longer tolerates neutrality. The European Union wants strategic autonomy, but Germany's export economy depends on China, while its security depends on America. These aren't contradictions politicians can speech their way out of. They're structural impossibilities in a fragmenting global order. The International Monetary Fund estimates the trade war and subsequent fragmentation could reduce global GDP by 7% over the next decade. That's $7 trillion. Not lost, just never created. It's the jobs that won't exist, the medicines that won't be developed, the infrastructure that won't be built because 2 superpowers couldn't figure out how to share an economy they both depend on. But here's what keeps me up at night. We're arguing about who won a trade war while missing the bigger picture. Climate change requires global cooperation on rare earth mining, battery production, and green technology. The next pandemic will require coordinated supply chains for vaccines and treatments. Artificial intelligence development is creating risks that no single country can manage alone. The trade war proved we can fragment global systems. The question we haven't answered is whether we can rebuild them. Because John Heisdorfer and Chen Wei and millions like them didn't lose their livelihoods to a necessary correction. They lost them to a political choice. And until we recognize that global trade isn't a zero-sum game but a mutual dependency, we'll keep making that choice. The tariffs might change, the rhetoric might soften, but the fundamental question remains: can two superpowers coexist economically, or are we watching the slow, painful birth of a divided world? Right now, the evidence suggests division, and everyone, whether they realize it or not, is paying the price. The official narrative says countries are decoupling. The reality is far messier. When the US banned the export of advanced chips to China in October 2022, something predictable happened. The black market industrialized. According to a 2023 report by C4ADS, a non-profit tracking illicit trade networks, restricted semiconductors were reaching Chinese companies through at least 43 shell companies operating across Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and the United Arab Emirates. The chips would be manufactured in Taiwan, sold to a distributor in Singapore, shipped to a warehouse in Dubai, relabeled as LED components, then forwarded to Shenzhen. The paper trail looked clean. The reality was a $12 billion gray market that made sanctions look performative. This isn't new. Every sanctions regime in history has created these parallel economies. What's different now is the scale and sophistication. Entire logistics companies exist solely to navigate tariff codes and sanctions lists. A laptop hard drive becomes automotive parts. A restricted AI chip becomes industrial sensors. Customs agents in smaller countries don't have the expertise or the incentive to verify what's really in those containers, and the countries hosting these shell companies. They're making too much money in handling fees to ask uncomfortable questions. Take Cambodia. In 2020, its exports to the United States increased by 350% in certain product categories. Did Cambodia suddenly become an industrial powerhouse? No. Chinese manufacturers were routing goods through Cambodian ports, doing minimal assembly to qualify for Made in Cambodia labels, then shipping them tariff-free to America under trade preference programs. The US trade representative caught on by 2022, but by then the infrastructure was permanent. Cambodia had built an entire economy around being a middleman in a trade war. This is the world we've created. Not two separate economic systems, but one deeply interconnected system, pretending to be separate. American companies still need Chinese rare earth elements. China still needs American semiconductors. The trade war didn't break these dependencies. It just made them more expensive and less transparent. And while politicians claim victory, corporations quietly adapted in ways that betray the entire premise of economic nationalism. Apple is the perfect case study. In 2018, over 90% of iPhones were assembled in China. By 2023, Apple had shifted significant production to India and Vietnam. Tim Cook gave speeches about diversification and resilience. But look closer, the sophisticated components, the A-series processors, the camera modules, the OLED screens, still came from Chinese suppliers or were made with Chinese materials. What moved to India was final assembly, the lowest margin, most labor-intensive part. Apple's supply chain didn't diversify, it just added steps. This pattern repeated across industries. Tesla builds cars in Shanghai for the Chinese market and Berlin for Europe. Nike manufactures in Vietnam but sources materials from Xinjiang. Amazon sells products made in a dozen countries, all containing Chinese components. These aren't examples of decoupling. They're examples of corporations doing what they've always done, optimizing for profit, while letting governments claim political victories. The harsh truth is this: the trade war changed where final assembly happens. It didn't change who controls the inputs. China still produces 80% of the world's solar panels, 70% of lithium-ion batteries, and holds patents on 67% of the critical technologies for electric vehicles, according to the International Energy Agency. You can't have a green revolution without Chinese supply chains. Europe and America can subsidize domestic production all they want, but they're a decade behind on manufacturing capacity and expertise. So what happens next? Three scenarios are emerging. The first is managed competition. The US and China establish rules for their rivalry, carving out areas for cooperation like climate and health, while competing on technology and security. This is what diplomats call for in think tank papers. It requires trust, which neither side has, and domestic political courage, which both lack. Possible, but unlikely. The second scenario is Cold War economics. Two fully separate systems with different technology standards, payment systems, and trade networks. China builds its Belt and Road sphere. America builds its Indo-Pacific Alliance network. Trade between the blocs drops to minimal levels. This is what's happening now, slowly, painfully. The cost is enormous, but the political momentum is real. Companies are already preparing for a world where they have to maintain completely separate operations for each market. The third scenario is what I call selective integration, official separation with unofficial connection. Governments maintain hostile rhetoric and formal barriers, but economic reality forces backdoor cooperation through third parties, grey markets, and neutral intermediaries. This is probably what we'll actually get. It's inefficient, corrupt, and unstable, but it's also the path of least resistance. Politicians get to look tough. Corporations get to maintain access. Everyone pretends the system works. But here's what all three scenarios have in common. None of them solve the original problems. American workers still need retraining for an automated economy. China still needs to transition from export dependence to domestic consumption. Global supply chains still need to be resilient against pandemics and climate shocks. The trade war addressed none of this. It just gave both countries an external enemy to blame for internal failures, and the cost of that blame game is already visible. According to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, global foreign direct investment fell 35% between 2018 and 2023. That's not money that disappeared. It's investment that didn't happen because uncertainty killed it. Factories that weren't built, technologies that weren't developed, jobs that never existed. You can't measure what didn't happen, but you can feel it in the slowdown of innovation, the aging of infrastructure, the sense that the global economy is running in place. Meanwhile, the problems that actually threaten humanity are getting worse. Climate change doesn't care about tariffs. The next pandemic won't respect trade blocs. Artificial intelligence development is accelerating in both countries with minimal coordination on safety or ethics. We're fragmenting our ability to cooperate precisely when cooperation matters most. This isn't pessimism, it's pattern recognition. Every major global challenge of the next 50 years requires the US and China to work together, or at least not actively sabotage each other. And we've just spent 5 years proving we'd rather score political points than solve problems. So here's where we actually are. The trade war didn't end because it was never really about trade. It's a symptom of a larger shift. A world order built on American dominance and Chinese integration is becoming a world of competing visions. Neither side is clearly winning. Both are paying enormous costs, and the rest of the world is being forced to navigate between them with no good options. The farmers in Iowa are still struggling. The factory workers in Guangdong found new jobs, but at lower wages. The promises of reshored manufacturing largely didn't materialize. The tariffs are still in place, now just an accepted cost of doing business. And the next crisis, whether it's a financial shock, a climate disaster, or a technological disruption, will hit a global system that's more fragile, more divided, and less capable of coordinated response than it was in 2018. That's the real cost of this trade war. Not the tariffs themselves, but the trust destroyed, the cooperation abandoned, and the shared future we decided wasn't worth the compromise. We didn't get a winner. We got a world that's harder to live in for everyone, and we're still pretending it was worth it.